She fed a poor boy when she was only 10 years old. He promised, "When I'm rich, I'll marry you." Life tore them apart before either understood love. What happened when he returned will leave you speechless. Winter always arrived early on the south side of Chicago. It crept in quietly, settling between cracked sidewalks and boarded windows, slipping through the holes in coats that were already too thin. By the time December showed its face, the cold no longer surprised anyone. It simply stayed, pressing itself into bones and breath. 12-year-old Ethan Carter learned early that hunger was louder in winter. It growled when the sun went down. It echoed when the wind cut through alleys. It mocked him when he tried to sleep. That evening, Ethan stood across the street from a small diner with a faded sign that read Hill's Family Kitchen. One of the bulbs flickered constantly, buzzing like it was tired of working. The windows fogged from the warmth inside, and through the glass, he could see steam rising from plates, hands passing food across counters, people laughing softly as if the world outside didn't exist. His stomach twisted. Ethan pulled his hoodie tighter around himself. It wasn't really his. He'd found it in a donation bin weeks ago, but it was better than nothing. Snow crunched beneath his sneakers as he shifted his weight, trying to look like he belonged there. Trying not to look like a boy with nowhere to go. He had learned that standing too long in one place drew attention. Attention brought questions. Questions brought trouble. So he paced. Back and forth. Back and forth. Across the street, inside the diner, Janet Hills balanced 2 plates on her arms, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. At 10 years old, she was small for her age, but she moved with purpose, like someone who already understood responsibility. Her hair was pulled into neat braids, the ends clicking softly against each other as she walked. "Janet, table 4 needs napkins," her mother called from behind the counter. "I got it," Janet replied quickly. She placed the plates down, smiled at the customers, and turned back toward the counter. That was when she noticed him. At first, she thought he was just another shadow on the street. There were always people outside, men leaning against buildings, teens hanging around corners. But this shadow didn't move like the others. He was her age, maybe a little older, and he was staring at the diner like it was something magical. Janet slowed her steps. Through the foggy glass, she watched him press his hands together, blowing into them for warmth. He looked thin. Too thin. His jeans were frayed at the bottom, darkened from melting snow. His eyes, she could see them even from inside, kept drifting toward the counter where plates of fried chicken and cornbread were being served. Her chest tightened. "Janet," her mother said again, softer this time. "You okay?" Janet nodded. "Yeah. Can I take out the trash?" Mrs. Hills raised an eyebrow. "Already? I'll do it," Janet insisted, already grabbing the bag. Her mother hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but be quick. It's cold." Janet pulled on her jacket and stepped out the back door, the warmth of the diner disappearing instantly. The alley smelled like oil and damp cardboard. Snow clung to the edges of dumpsters. She walked slowly, pretending to struggle with the trash bag, glancing toward the front of the diner. The boy was still there. He noticed her watching and stiffened. His shoulders rose defensively, like he was ready to run. Janet's heart thumped. She'd never done this before. Never talked to a stranger like this. But something about the way he looked at the diner, like it was hope itself, made her brave. She cleared her throat. "Hey," she said. Ethan froze. He turned slowly, eyes wide, calculating. Adults were dangerous. Adults asked questions. Adults made calls. But this wasn't an adult. She was a kid, younger than him. And she wasn't yelling. I wasn't doing anything," he said quickly. Janet shook her head. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. "You hungry?" she asked. Ethan's stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. His face burned. Janet smiled gently. "Wait here." Before he could respond, she disappeared back inside. Ethan considered running. Everything in his life had taught him that kindness came with conditions, that help was never free. But his feet didn't move. A minute later, Janet returned, holding a paper-wrapped bundle. She held it out. "For you." Ethan stared at it like it might vanish. I don't have money." Janet shrugged. "It's leftovers. We were going to throw it out." That wasn't true, but Ethan didn't know that. He took it carefully, like it might explode. His fingers brushed hers briefly. They were warm. "Thanks," he muttered. Janet nodded, suddenly shy. "I'm Janet. Ethan." She pointed toward a stack of old crates behind the diner. "You can sit there. It's less windy. They sat side by side, the crate cold beneath them. Ethan unwrapped the food, cornbread, greens, a piece of chicken. The smell alone made his eyes sting. He ate slowly at first, then faster, then stopped when he realized she was watching. "What?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. Just don't choke." That made him laugh, a short, surprised sound. He hadn't laughed in a long time. From that night on, it became their secret. Every evening after school, Janet would sneak out with something small. Half a sandwich. A biscuit. Sometimes just a cup of hot soup in a lid-covered container. Ethan waited across the street, always in a different spot. Always watching. They talked. About school. About teachers they hated. About the cold. Ethan told her about the shelter he sometimes stayed in, about how loud it was, how his backpack had everything he owned. He didn't talk about his mother much. When he did, his voice went flat. Janet listened. She always listened. She told him about the diner, about how her mom worked all the time, about her little brother who refused to eat vegetables. One night, snow falling thick around them, Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I made this," he said. It was a drawing. Messy lines. A tall building with windows everywhere. "That's going to be mine," he said quietly. "One day." Janet studied it seriously. "You drew that?" "Yeah. It's cool," she said. "Really cool." Something in her voice made his chest feel strange. Like something warm had been placed there. "You think I could really do it?" he asked. Janet nodded without hesitation. "Yeah." He looked at her then, really looked. The way her breath fogged the air. The way she believed him like it was obvious. "When I'm rich one day," he said suddenly, words tumbling out, "I'll come back and marry you." Janet blinked. Then she laughed. "That's dumb," she said. Ethan's ears turned red. "Yeah, I know. She smiled, softer this time. "You better not forget me." "I won't," he said immediately. "I promise." Promises felt easy at 12. The next afternoon, Ethan didn't show up. Janet waited behind the diner, food cooling in her hands. An hour passed. Then 2. The wind picked up, biting at her cheeks. Finally, her mother called her inside. The next day, she waited again. And again. Ethan never came back. Weeks later, Janet overheard her mother talking to a neighbor. "Child services took him," the woman said quietly. "Boy was sleeping behind the church. Someone reported it." Janet's heart dropped. That night, she sat on her bed, holding the crumpled drawing Ethan had given her. The building with too many windows. She didn't know where he went. She didn't know if he was safe. She didn't know if he remembered her. But somewhere deep inside, a 10-year-old girl held onto a promise made by a hungry boy in the cold. And winter went on. Time did not ask Janet Hills for permission before it started moving faster. At first, it crept. Days after Ethan disappeared felt long and hollow, like rooms with the furniture taken out. Janet still went behind the diner every afternoon out of habit. She still carried extra food in her pockets, just in case. Each time, she told herself it would be the last. Each time, she waited anyway. Winter ended. Snow melted into dirty slush. Spring arrived, then summer, and the crates behind the diner stayed empty. At 10 years old, Janet didn't have the language for grief. She only knew something was missing. Something small but important. Something no one else seemed to notice. So she folded it away. By 13, Janet understood that life didn't stop just because something hurt. Her mother woke up at 4 every morning to open the diner. Janet woke up at 6 to get herself and her little brother ready for school. By the time other kids were worrying about dances and crushes, Janet was learning how to balance a register and mop floors properly. The diner became her world. She grew taller. Her braids got longer. Her hands grew stronger. Customers watched her grow up behind that counter, shaking their heads and saying things like, "Feels like just yesterday you were barely reaching the register." Janet smiled politely every time. At night, when the diner was quiet and her homework was done, she sometimes pulled out the old drawing. The paper had softened with age, the edges curled. The tall building still stood proudly in pencil lines. She never told anyone where it came from. Across the city, and then across the state, Ethan Carter learned a different kind of growing up. The foster home was loud. That was the first thing he noticed. Too many kids. Too many rules. Too many eyes watching him like he might break something just by being there. The bed creaked when he turned at night. The walls smelled like bleach and old carpet. No one asked him what he liked to eat. No one asked him what he dreamed about. They asked him if he'd finished his chores. They asked him why his grades weren't better. They asked him to stop being difficult. Ethan learned quickly that quiet kids survived longer. So he became quiet. He kept his head down in school, finishing his work faster than anyone else. Math made sense to him. Numbers behaved. They followed rules. They didn't disappear without explanation. Teachers noticed. By 14, he'd been moved twice more. One home was kind but overwhelmed. Another was cold and distant. At one point, he slept in his clothes, afraid of losing them. At night, when the lights were out and the house finally quiet, Ethan thought about the diner. About the way warmth spilled out when the door opened. About Janet's laugh, quick and unguarded. About the promise. It embarrassed him now, remembering it. Kids said stupid things. Big things they didn't understand. But the feeling behind it, the certainty that he could become more, that stayed. Janet was 16 when her mother collapsed in the diner kitchen. It happened in the middle of the lunch rush. One moment Mrs. Hills was calling out orders, the next she was on the floor, clutching her chest. Plates shattered. Someone screamed. Janet froze for half a second. Then she moved. She called 911. She knelt beside her mother, her hands shaking but steady enough. She shouted instructions at customers who didn't know where to stand. When the paramedics arrived, they nodded at her like she was an adult. Her mother survived. But nothing went back to normal. Medical bills piled up fast. The diner started closing early some nights. Janet stopped thinking about leaving the neighborhood someday. College brochures went unopened in a drawer. By 18, Janet was running the diner in all but name. She learned how to negotiate with suppliers, how to smile when customers complained, how to swallow exhaustion and keep moving. Sometimes, late at night, she stood alone behind the counter and imagined what it would feel like to leave, to go somewhere new. But she never did. Ethan left home at 17. Not dramatically, not with shouting or slammed doors. He simply didn't come back one afternoon. He had a scholarship acceptance letter folded in his pocket and $53 to his name. The bus station smelled like old coffee and desperation. He sat with his backpack between his feet, heart pounding, terrified and thrilled in equal measure. College was harder than he expected. Not the classes, the people. He didn't know how to talk about his childhood without killing the mood. He didn't know how to relax when things were going well. He slept lightly, always half expecting someone to tell him to leave. But he worked. God, did he work? He studied until his eyes burned. He took part-time jobs fixing computers, tutoring classmates, cleaning labs at night. Professors noticed his focus. A mentor took him under his wing. Ethan discovered he loved building systems, software, networks, things that solved problems at scale. He remembered the drawing. The building with too many windows. Janet turned 25 the same week the diner nearly closed. The bank manager spoke gently, like he was explaining something to a child. Janet nodded, even when her stomach twisted. She thanked him when he finished. Outside, the sun was bright. Too bright. She sat on the curb behind the diner, head in her hands, and let herself cry for exactly 1 minute. Then she stood up and went back to work. That night, while cleaning out an old drawer, she found the drawing again. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, and stared at it longer than she had in years. "I hope you're okay," she whispered to no one. Ethan saw the article by accident. He was 30 now. His startup, once an idea scribbled on a whiteboard, had just secured another round of funding. His name appeared in industry blogs. People called him visionary. The article was small. Local news. Historic neighborhood diner struggles to stay open. The photo stopped him cold. The sign was faded but unmistakable. Hill's family kitchen. His breath caught. He stared at the screen for a long time, something tight forming in his chest. Janet. He didn't know her last name back then. He'd never asked. He only knew her face as it was years ago. Young, kind, serious. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He told himself he was too late. But that night, for the first time in years, Ethan dreamed of a crate behind a diner and a girl who believed in him before anyone else did. And somewhere in Chicago, Janet Hills locked up the diner and walked home under flickering streetlights, unaware that a promise she'd buried long ago had just been remembered. The bell above the diner door hadn't changed. It still rang with the same tired jingle it always had, the sound slightly off-key, like it had lost part of itself over the years. Janet Hills barely noticed it anymore. It was background noise, woven into her life as tightly as the smell of frying oil and coffee. She stood behind the counter, wiping it down with slow, practiced movements. It was late afternoon, too early for dinner, too late for lunch. The quiet hour. The bell rang. Janet didn't look up right away. "Sit anywhere you like," she called out automatically. No response. She glanced up. The man standing just inside the doorway did not belong there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that looked expensive without trying to. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, his posture careful, like someone used to being watched. He stood still, eyes scanning the diner as if he were walking through a memory rather than a room. Janet frowned. "You okay?" He swallowed. "Yeah. Is this Hill's family kitchen?" Her irritation flickered. People asked that sometimes, like they couldn't believe a place this small had survived this long. "Yes," she said flatly. "That's what the sign says." He nodded slowly, like the answer mattered more than it should have. "I'll just sit," he said. He chose a booth near the back, the one closest to the kitchen, the one Janet's mother used to sit in when her feet hurt. Janet watched him as she poured coffee into a mug, her instincts humming. He wasn't staring at her the way some men did. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't impatient. He was absorbing. She brought the menu over anyway. "You know what you want?" He glanced at the laminated page, then back at her. "Do you still make cornbread?" Janet froze. Her hand tightened around the menu. "Yes," she said carefully. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Something shifted in her chest. She didn't like it. She took his order, cornbread, greens, chicken, coffee, and walked back behind the counter, her pulse loud in her ears. "Get it together," she told herself. "He's just a customer." But when she brought the plate out, the man stood instead of staying seated. "Janet Hills," he said softly. Her breath left her all at once. She stared at him, really stared, at the familiar shape of his eyes, at the way his mouth pulled slightly to the left when he was nervous. At the scar near his eyebrow she suddenly remembered. He'd gotten it climbing a fence once. "No," she whispered. He nodded. "Yeah." The plate slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Coffee splashed. A piece of chicken skidded under a table. Janet didn't move. The diner felt too small. Too quiet. "It's me," he said quickly. "It's Ethan." Her laugh burst out sharp and disbelieving. "That's not funny." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't joke about this." She stepped back, heart hammering. You were a kid." "So were you," he said. The words hit harder than she expected. She looked at him again, really this time, seeing the boy layered under the man. The hunger in his eyes was gone, but the carefulness remained. "You just show up?" she demanded. "After all this time?" "I didn't know how else to do it," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't even know if you'd still be here." Janet crossed her arms, the old hurt rising like it had been waiting. "You disappeared." His jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice." "You didn't come back," she snapped. "Not once. Not a letter. Nothing." "I was 12, he said, pain flickering across his face. "They moved me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how to find you." She turned away, bending to pick up the broken plate, her hands shaking. "You made a promise." He exhaled slowly. "I know." She straightened, eyes bright. "You said you wouldn't forget me." "I didn't," he said immediately. "I swear to you I didn't." Silence stretched between them, thick with years unsaid. Finally, Janet gestured toward the booth. "Sit down." He obeyed instantly. She brought him another plate, hands steadier now, and set it down harder than necessary. "Eat." He hesitated. "I'll pay for." "Eat," she repeated. He did. They didn't talk while he ate. Janet busied herself behind the counter, listening to the scrape of utensils, the quiet clink of the coffee cup. When he finished, she sat across from him. "So," she said. "You rich?" He huffed a humorless laugh. "Comfortable." She nodded. "Good for you." "I didn't come back to show off," he said quickly. "Why did you come back then?" she asked. He looked at his hands. "Because I owed you more than silence." The words landed heavy. She studied him, searching for arrogance, for pity, for anything she could reject. She found none. The bell above the door rang as a couple of customers walked in. Life moved on around them. Janet stood. "I have work to do." "I know," Ethan said. "I won't take up more of your time." She paused, then said quietly, "You already did. A long time ago." That night, after closing, Janet sat alone in the diner, lights dimmed, the city humming outside. Across town, Ethan sat in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying her face over and over. Neither of them slept, because some promises, once remembered, refused to stay buried. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that only existed in cities just before they fully woke up, when the streets still belonged to street sweepers, delivery trucks, and people carrying more than they showed. Janet unlocked the diner before sunrise, the metal gate screeching in protest as she pulled it up. She paused with the key still in the lock. For the first time in years, her chest felt crowded. Not with worry about bills. Not with exhaustion. But with something unfinished. Ethan Carter. She shook her head, annoyed at herself, and stepped inside. The diner smelled the same as it always had. Old coffee. Clean floors. Memory. Janet flipped on the lights one by one, the bulbs humming awake. She tied her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. But her hands moved slower. Her mind wouldn't stay still. She remembered the way he'd said her name. Carefully. Like it mattered. She remembered how quickly he'd obeyed when she told him to sit, how he hadn't argued, hadn't tried to take control. That bothered her more than arrogance would have. By mid-morning, the diner filled with its usual crowd. Retired men nursing coffee. Construction workers grabbing early lunch. A mother with 2 kids splitting pancakes. And gossip. "You hear about that man who came in yesterday?" One woman whispered at the counter. Janet kept her eyes on the grill. "Heard he's rich," the woman continued. "Drove up in some fancy car." Janet's jaw tightened. Another voice chimed in. "Probably trying to buy the place." Janet turned around sharply. "Order up." The voices quieted. But the words stayed. Ethan didn't come back that day. Or the next. Janet told herself she was relieved. Still, when the bell didn't ring, something in her sagged. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Not by mail. By hand. It was slipped under the diner door before opening hours. A thick envelope. Cream-colored. Heavy. Janet stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Her name was written on the front in careful handwriting. She sat in the nearest booth and opened it. Inside were documents. Official-looking. Legal. Her stomach twisted. At the top of the first page, she saw the words, "Debt satisfaction notice." She flipped through the pages, breath quickening. Every outstanding loan. Every overdue payment. Cleared. At the bottom was a short note. No announcements. No press. No ownership changes. This place stays yours. E. Janet's hands shook. Anger flared first. Who did he think he was? Fixing things without asking. Deciding what she needed. Walking back into her life like money gave him permission. She stood so fast the booth creaked. But as the anger burned, something else surfaced beneath it. Relief. And under that grief, she pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. "Damn it," she whispered. That evening, Janet walked instead of taking the bus. The city lights flickered on as the sun dipped low. She passed familiar blocks, familiar faces. People nodded at her. Some waved. She didn't stop. Ethan's hotel wasn't hard to find. It was the kind of place she'd never stepped into before, glass, steel, quiet confidence. The doorman glanced at her, then smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Ethan Carter," she said. The name carried weight. She felt it in the way the man's posture shifted. "One moment, ma'am." Minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Ethan stepped out. He froze when he saw her. "Janet." She folded her arms. "We need to talk." He nodded immediately. "Yes, of course." They sat in the lobby lounge, far from the windows. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, she slid the envelope across the table. "You had no right," she said. "I know," he replied quietly. Her eyes flashed. "Then why did you do it?" "Because you were drowning," he said. "And because you saved me once when you didn't have to." "That was different," she snapped. "I was a kid." "So was I," he said. "And you fed me anyway." She swallowed. "I didn't do it to be repaid." "I know," he said. "That's why it mattered." Silence settled again. "I didn't come back to buy your forgiveness," Ethan continued. "I came back because I owed you the truth." Janet looked at him then. Really looked. "Say it," she said. He took a breath. "I wasn't brave enough to come back sooner." The honesty landed harder than any excuse. "I was scared," he went on. "Scared that I'd ruin something pure. Scared you'd look at me like I was nothing but a ghost." Janet's voice softened despite herself. "You were a ghost." "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry." For the first time, she believed him. She leaned back, exhaustion washing over her. "That promise you made," she said quietly. It stuck with me longer than it should have. His throat tightened. I never meant to trap you in it. I know, she said. But words, they do things. Especially when you don't have much else. He nodded slowly. I don't want to be the reason you stop choosing yourself. She studied him. Then what do you want? He met her gaze steadily. To make peace with the past. And if, only if, you want to start something new. Slowly. As equals. Janet closed her eyes. She thought of the little girl behind the diner with cold hands and a full heart. She thought of the woman she'd become. When she opened her eyes, her voice was steady. I don't need a savior, she said. I know, Ethan replied. I don't need a promise made by a hungry boy. I know. She stood. But I'll accept accountability from a grown man. Hope flickered in his eyes, careful, restrained. That, he said, I can give. They walked out together into the night. Not hand in hand. Not yet. Just side by side. And for the first time since winter so many years ago, the unfinished sentence between them finally found its ending. Not in riches, not in rescue, but in truth. Some promises aren't kept the way they're spoken. But the kindness behind them? That never disappears. The bell above the diner door rang on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Janet Hills glanced up from the register, already forming a greeting out of habit, then paused. Ethan stood there, no suit this time. Just a dark jacket, worn boots, and a paper bag folded neatly under his arm. You're early, she said. He smiled. I know. She nodded toward the counter. Coffee? Yes, please. He took his usual seat in the back booth. Their booth now, though neither of them said it out loud. Janet poured the coffee, slid it over, and returned to wiping the counter. This had become their rhythm. He didn't come every day. He didn't make announcements. He didn't try to fix things that weren't broken. When he did show up, he ate, listened, asked about her mother, about her brother, about the diner. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they didn't. The city kept moving around them. A month after Ethan's return, the diner's windows were repaired. 2 months later, the flickering bulb in the sign was replaced. Janet paid for both herself. One afternoon, a neighborhood kid, skinny, quiet, eyes always watching, hovered near the doorway. Janet noticed him first. You hungry? She asked gently. The boy nodded. Janet turned without thinking, packed a plate, and slid it across the counter. The boy's eyes widened. Ethan watched from his booth, chest tight. Janet met his gaze for a brief second. No words passed between them. None were needed. Later that evening, as they locked up together, Ethan gestured toward the old crates stacked behind the diner. Still there, worn but standing. You know, he said, I used to think that promise was about the future. Janet smiled faintly. It never was. He nodded. It was about not being invisible. She stopped, looked at him fully. You were never invisible. They stood there, the city humming around them, the past no longer heavy, just present. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something folded and worn. The drawing. The building with too many windows. I built it, he said quietly. Not the exact one, but the idea. Janet traced the lines with her finger. I knew you would. He looked at her then, really looked. Not as the girl who fed him, not as the woman who carried a neighborhood on her back, but as someone choosing her own future. Whatever comes next, he said. I want it to be honest. Janet smiled. That's all I ever asked. The bell jingled as they stepped back inside. Outside, winter threatened again, but this time, no one was hungry. The first time Ethan reached for Janet's hand, it wasn't dramatic. They were closing the diner late, the kind of late that came from talking too much and moving too slowly. Chairs were upside down on tables. The floors were clean. Outside, the city hummed with distant sirens and passing cars. Janet locked the register and sighed. I'm getting too old for 16-hour days. Ethan smiled. You say that every week. And every week it becomes more true. They laughed. Then the quiet settled, the comfortable kind. As they walked toward the door, Ethan's hand hovered near hers, uncertain. Janet noticed. She stopped, turned slightly, and waited. He took her hand then, gently, like he still wasn't sure the world wouldn't take it away. She squeezed once. Just once. That was all it took. They didn't rush. That was the unspoken rule they both seemed to understand. They dated like people who had already lived too much life to pretend. No games. No disappearing acts. No pretending to be less afraid than they were. They talked. A lot. about the foster homes, about Janet's mother and the nights Janet cried alone, about guilt, about survival, about the strange pressure of being called successful when you still felt like a hungry kid inside. Some nights, Ethan sat in the diner after closing, laptop open, working quietly while Janet finished paperwork. Other nights, they walked the neighborhood, hands brushing, pointing out places that had changed and places that hadn't. The crates behind the diner stayed where they were. Neither of them suggested moving them. The proposal didn't come with cameras or crowds. It came on a snowy evening, years after the first one. The diner was closed. The lights were low. Ethan stood behind the counter, awkward and nervous, holding something in his hands. Janet raised an eyebrow. "Why are you standing like that?" "Because if I sit, I might chicken out." She crossed her arms. "Ethan." He took a breath. "I made a promise when I was 12, he said. It was clumsy, too big, and I didn't understand what it meant." Janet's expression softened. "I don't want to keep that promise," he continued. "I want to make a new one." He knelt, not smoothly, not perfectly, and opened a small box. "I promise to show up," he said. "Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I promise not to disappear. I promise to choose you every day, not because I owe you, but because I love you." Janet covered her mouth, tears already falling. "Yes," she said through a laugh. "Yes, Ethan." They married in the spring. Not in a ballroom. Not in a cathedral. In the neighborhood. The ceremony took place in a small community garden 2 blocks from the diner. Folding chairs. String lights. Flowers donated by a local shop. Janet wore a simple dress. Ethan wore a suit that still felt strange on him. Mrs. Hills sat in the front row, hands clasped, eyes shining. When Janet walked down the aisle, Ethan didn't see the crowd. He saw a little girl with braids holding out food behind a diner. When they exchanged vows, Janet said quietly, "You don't have to be rich anymore." Ethan smiled, eyes wet. "I know." The diner stayed open. So did the building Ethan built, now employing people who came from places like the one that raised him. Scholarships were funded quietly. Community programs ran without his name attached. Sometimes, late at night, Janet and Ethan sat on the crates behind the diner, coffee in hand, the city breathing around them. "Funny," Janet said once, "that a promise made in hunger turned into this." Ethan nodded. "Turns out it wasn't about marriage at all." She leaned into him. "What was it about then?" "Being seen," he said, "and choosing to stay." And this time, neither of them ever left. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more interesting stories. We really appreciate your support. Comment where you are watching from, so we can give you a shout out. See you in our next video.